Yeah. A very good afternoon, everybody. Uh, Respected invited speaker, Professor Jung from Republic of Korea, and my colleagues, and also the participants from throughout the world, I think, so specifically for the Asian countries. So today, uh, we will have one lecture on Korean anthropology, and we again resume our international lecture series on historical development of anthropology in Asia. So before I proceed, I would like to invite Dr. Tharakananda to give the welcome address.
Thank you very much, sir. Dear professors, doctors, and my dear colleagues, first let me welcome our invited speaker, Professor Han Jin-jung, Professor, Department of Anthropology, Seoul National University, Republic of Korea, and also our chief advisors of 3 institutes, Professor Chamalina Hallage, Department of Anthropology, University of Sri Jayawardhanepura, Sri Lanka, and also the principal of MDM, and also the principal of DNGC, Dr. MQ Khan, and also the coordinator of this international lecture series, Dr. Suman Chakrabarti, head of the Department of Anthropology, MDM, and also the joint conveners, Dr. Ratan Tayeng from DNGC, and Dr. Sushmita Sen from MDM. And also I would like to warmly welcome our members, Dr. Pushpalata Tigga, Mr. Gopal Reba, Mr. Tanushree Poli, and Ms. Saswati Roy. And also I warmly welcome all the participants to our 9th lecture of the Historical Evolution as a Discipline in Asia, our international lecture series. All are warmly welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tharakananda, for your welcome address. So before we start to hand over the platform, so let me give some minutes to introduce Professor Jung Jung. She is a professor at the Department of Anthropology at Seoul National University, South Korea. She received her PhD in cultural anthropology in 2001 from University of Minnesota and USA, and has been teaching at Seoul National University since 2003. With a subdisciplinary training in psychological anthropology, her research interests center around the interaction among the culture, self, and emotion, while US and the 2 Koreas are her primary anthropological sites. She has done research studies about the emotional culture of postmodern American society, the psychocultural underpinning of the North Korean statehood and society, and education and the socialization of emotion in South Korea. She is the author of Learning to be an Individual, Emotions and Persons in American Junior High Schools, and Anthropology of the Korean Family and Kinship. This is edited volume in Korean, Singapore National University Press, 2018, and Korean Psychological Anthropology, special issues, published in Ethos in 2021. She has also published in various journals in Korean or English about the Korean education, South Korean education, North Korean political culture, and US culture of authenticity. So with this very, very brief note, I welcome Professor Jung to deliver today's talk. Madam, now the platform is yours.
Okay. Thank you so very much for inviting me to be a guest lecturer to this series. I'm really honored to be part of this series, and I was so pleased to have the invitation because I was thinking a lot lately about international communications between different anthropologists, particularly those anthropologists based in Asia. So Thank you again. So today I will be talking about the historical development of Korean anthropology in South Korea. So let's see, I titled my lecture Korean Anthropology, a Historical Contour. Okay. All right, okay. So I will follow through the slides that I prepared. If you have any questions, quick questions during my talk, let me know. Okay, so there were very early interest in the late 19th century, and soon colonial anthropology began. So you see this cover photo of a book entitled as 100 Years of Korean Anthropology by Jung. Jung is an anthropologist, and he is a former teacher of mine, and he wrote this historical account of Korean anthropology. So my account today is primarily drawn from his historical account. So he said, so in his title, he said 100 years. So by 100 years, he meant to point out that there was an essay in 1896 about Taylorian anthropology by a Korean, Go Jung. He was a Korean national. At the time, he was studying abroad in Japan. So then we think that he was introduced to anthropology while he was studying in Japan. So he wrote this essay. But after this, very soon, Korea became colonized by Japan. So there could not be enough development before Japanese colonial rule. So colonial rule was from 1910 to 1945. So during this time, Japanese ethnology and folklore studies and Japanese physical anthropology were introduced to colonial Korea. So at the time, in Japan, cultural anthropology was called ethnology, and then there was a sort of a sister discipline. As a sister discipline, there was folklore studies, and when they said anthropology, they meant physical anthropology. So in Japan, these ethnology, folklore studies, and physical anthropology was sort of starting, and they were introduced from the West, Germany, and also Britain, primarily. So Japanese intellectuals were beginning to practice anthropology, modern anthropology, and then when they had colonial Korea, so then colonial Korea became a primary ethnological and anthropological subject to Japan, to Japanese anthropologists, ethnologists, and anthropologists. Okay, so during this colonial time, Japanese ethnologists were mainly focused on folkways. So for Koreans, folkways were their main interest. And the background of this is that Korea as a whole was seen as a folk, okay? And then, and the Koreans' anatomical features were the main subject of physical anthropology. And so, and then Keijo Imperial University. Keijo Imperial University is the colonial university. It became Seoul National University later. So Keijo means Gyeongsang. Gyeongsang is really Seoul. So it could be translated as Seoul Imperial University. Imperial means, of course, Japanese Imperial. So Keijo Imperial University, it had a sociology division, and then in that division, there were a couple of Japanese ethnologists. And so this sociology division was a center of Japanese ethnology and anthropologist wartime efforts. Okay, so as Japan had war over Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, and this Keijo Imperial University became a center of war efforts whereby intellectuals like ethnologists and physical anthropologists were employed to do their disciplinary work, aiming, in war efforts. Okay, so Gyeongsu-jeon had recorded some of these wartime efforts of Japanese ethnologists and physical anthropologists in detail. So while this colonial anthropology was going on, there were Korean intellectuals who worked together with Japanese ethnologists, or who worked separately from them, but nevertheless they were influenced by the Japanese ethnologists. So to these Korean intellectuals, some of them were trained in Japan, in the metro cities of Imperial Japan. So they came back, and then they studied Korean folkways. So to them, Korean folkways was a nationalistic nationalist enterprise. So they began collecting folklore items, or they did surveys. So they were their folklore studies were very much in the same fashion as Japanese folklore studies or ethnology did about Korean folkways. But to them, Korean folklore studies was a nationalist enterprise. So there were these Japanese ethnologists and then Korean ethnologists or folklore scholars. And then they were similar in their practice, but their political outlook was different, of course. Okay. All right. So here I talk more about anthropologists' colonial legacy and modernist aspiration. I put unresolved in parentheses because Korea's anthropologists' colonial legacy is really unresolved. Just like many of colonial legacy of Korean academic work or Korean society in general, it's unresolved, much of it. So that's the same situation in anthropology too. So in 1945, we were liberated and also we were divided by US and USSR, so North and South. So then during this time, so between liberation in 1945 and the Korean War broke out in 1950. So in between this period, so 5 years period, there was effort to establish Department of Anthropology at Seoul National University. So Keijo University, Imperial University, so Seoul National University was established in part by inheriting Keijo Imperial University. So at Seoul National University, several intellectuals who were trained in ethnographic research during the colonial time. They wanted to establish the Department of Anthropology, and it looks like they did, but it's not there is not much of evidence, but there are circumstantial evidence. So I put it in quotation marks. So there was some effort to establish Department of Anthropology, and the same people, particularly there was one person who really pushed forward to establish the National Museum of Ethnology. So he did establish the National Museum of Ethnology, but it was really short-lived because when the Korean War broke out, this National Museum of Ethnology was sort of, disarrayed, and it was sort of, there were not enough people to really took care of the museum during the war. And also during the war, a lot of intellectuals were either killed or kidnapped to North Korea or abducted to North Korea. So after the Korean War, there was not really a joke, but it was a joke that really reflected the reality. People said that in the South, there isn't any intellectuals left because so many intellectuals went to the North, okay? So there was a big loss of intellectuals in the South after the war. So the Department of Anthropology was now realized, and then the National Museum of Ethnology was established, but it was short-lived. So it's gone now. And there was nothing really around about anthropology at the time. So, and then in 1966, there was a small exhibition hall called Korea Folk Pavilion was established. And it soon developed to Korean Folk Museum, and then 1979, it became National Folk Museum of Korea, which is still functioning. It is in Seoul. If you come to Seoul, you can go to this National Folk Museum of Korea. It's adjacent to Gyeongbok Palace in the center of Seoul. So here, I see, ethnology is gone now. Folk replaced ethnology. And I think this really signals a change in public sentiment at the time. So right after Korea was liberated, and I think Koreans were really looking forward to the future, to be part of the world as an independent nation state. But then there was a Korean War, and then South Korea became sort of like an island country. And then with all the devastations of the war, and then Koreans had to, they had this task of modernization and all this chaos, and then this urbanization and a lot of things going on. So people generally became sort of inward looking, I think. So they were more interested in folk because, the Korean society as a whole was really rapidly developing during the 1960s and 70s. And so things like folkways were really disappearing. So then people began to see folk as a central locus of Korean culture. They were sort of lamenting that folk was disappearing and the essence of Korean culture was disappearing. So then folklore studies became a disciplinary backup for the Korean cultural identity building, I think. So then there's a very historical event took place around this time. In 1967, Cultural Heritage Administration of the government, they commissioned nationwide folk weight survey. Okay, so this was a huge project. It lasted two decades. So then with this survey project, folklorists and cultural anthropologists, they worked together, and then they produced many publications. So, you know, with this historical development, you can see that, you know, Koreans' main interests were in Korean folk culture, okay? All right. Now, in the area of social cultural anthropology, okay, so in 1958, so Korean War was from 1950 through 1953. So 5 years after the war was ended, the Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology was established. And then 10 years later, they started the flagship journal, Korean Cultural Anthropology. Okay, so, but you note that the Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology, this society was really started by folklore scholars, okay? So they were trained during the colonial period, or if they were not trained during the colonial period, they were not nevertheless succeeding the colonial folklore study tradition in many ways, okay? So, but then they thought that cultural anthropology was the future of folklore studies. And then that's why they named their professional society as Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology. Okay, there were some professional society for folklore studies proper, but these folklore scholars who established the Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology, they were prominent folklore scholars. And then they did think that cultural anthropology was the way to go, so to speak. So once they started this professional society, Western trained cultural anthropologists later joined this Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology. But in 1970s, unfortunately, folklore studies and social cultural anthropology increasingly went separate ways. Okay, they just could not find ways to be together. Because social cultural anthropologists, they were very critical of folklore studies for what they saw as preoccupation with out of context descriptions of custom items. And social cultural anthropologists, of course, they aimed to professionalize anthropology as a scientific discipline. And they did study Korean culture, but also they wanted to study other cultures as well. So there was some sort of paradigm clash. So there were problems around personal kind of conflict too, but mainly it's a conflict between different paradigms. Okay, or anthropology was seen sort of as an imposition of Western paradigm by some of the folklore scholars. Okay, and then from the social cultural anthropologist perspective, folklore studies was just, it didn't have a future. It was just so description basis, and it was not theorizing enough. So they just could not come together to reconcile their differences. All right. Okay. Now, and then at this backdrop, social cultural anthropology began to establish itself in academic institutions. Okay, So 1961, at Seoul National University, Department of Archaeology and Anthropology was established. And 1975, they separated out. So the Department of Anthropology, currently my department, so Department of Anthropology moved to the newly founded College of Social Sciences, and then archaeology joined with art history, and then they were under the College of Humanities. Okay, so College of Social Sciences and College of Humanities and Social Sciences were together before 1975, but they split out. So anthropology took the opportunity to spin off and then separate out from archaeology. So that's our institutional arrangement now. And so the Department of Anthropology at Seoul National University really started out as an independent department. And during the 1980s and 90s, more departmental establishment at universities. And then in the meantime, folklore studies, they didn't really succeed in academic, in universities, but they had more expansion in professional societies and museums. Okay, so regional museums would have a very strong orientation in folklore studies. Okay, so it was sort of anthropology expanded more in universities, and folklore studies more in museums, and that they have a lot more members, and they have more professional societies because they have folklore studies draw from a wider variety of disciplines. So universities do not really have a department of folklore studies. There's one university currently that has Department of Folklore Studies. Okay, and then physical anthropology. Okay, in Korea, primarily when we say anthropology, it's primarily social cultural anthropology. But in 1958, Korean Association of Physical Anthropologists, this professional society, was established. It was a succession of the colonial professional society of physical anthropology. And then some 30 years later, they began their flagship journal. But physical anthropology, so you can see the name, the title of the journal, it's Anatomy and Biological Anthropology. So they are really from most of the scholars in this association are from anatomy, in medicine, and in dental science. Okay, and then it's really anatomical features, descriptions of anatomical features. Okay, so it's not really anthropologically strong, you might say, but in 2002 there was a first biological anthropology hire at SNU in my university. So we still have one biological anthropology, but this was a significant move in our department. Okay. So currently, institutional establishment of anthropology look like this in overall. Okay, so there are 11 departments or programs. Just for your comparison, in sociology there are more than 40. Okay, so anthropology is one of the least represented disciplines in South Korea. So that's, like I said, it's predominantly social cultural anthropology, And in regional universities, they tend to have a joint program of archaeology and cultural anthropology because, you know, Korea being, Korea having a long historical, long history. So there's lots of archaeological sites. So, but these joint programs, in these joint programs, archaeologists and cultural anthropologists, they they don't really work together, I don't think. So it's just a joint program for convenience. And within the anthropology department, there have been strong efforts to be inclusive of folklore studies, because anthropologists do know that, you know, folklore studies can be very useful in the areas of regional revitalization and cultural heritage. So just to take a look at different university, different departments, different arrangements of cultural anthropology or anthropology in Korea. SNU has anthropology. So the department is called Department of Anthropology. It's not just the cultural anthropology. We have one biological anthropology, and then we also have one cultural anthropologist whose work very much focused on folklore studies. Okay, and Yonsei, Dokseong Women's, Hanyang, Yeongnam, Gangwon, Academy of Korean Studies, they are all cultural anthropology. Academy of Korean Studies, they only have graduate program. Okay, and Jeonbuk, Jeonnam, Mokpo, Gyeongbuk, they are regional universities. They have joint programs of archaeology and cultural anthropology. Okay. And doctoral program studied at SNU in 1983. And then currently nationwide, there are 10 doctoral programs in anthropology. Okay. Just a photo, picture of South Korea, just to show you where anthropology departments or programs are. So here, this is Seoul area. So Seoul has 3, and then in the metro area, 2 more. So there's some concentration here, and then regional universities have this. Okay, I am personally from Busan here, and then my hometown doesn't have any anthropology department, which I regret. Okay. All right. Now, scholarly establishment. Okay. Koreans, so there's one professional society, Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology. And journals, we have 3 journals. Korean Cultural Anthropology, the first of this, in the photo, the cover photo. And this is published 3 times a year. And then Cross Cultural Studies, the second one here, twice a year. And then Korean Anthropology Review. This is an English journal. This is a yearly annual journal. We studied this. So the first journal is published by the Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology. And then the second and third one, these 2 journals are published by the Department of Anthropology at SNU. So our department publishes these 2 journals. The English journal, this is not an ordinary English journal. This is a translation journal. So Korean Anthropology Review publishes articles that, translation articles. We translate articles which were previously published in Korean in these 2 journals. Okay, so this English translation journal is our effort for international conversations of Korean anthropology. For conferences, we have annual forum. The Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology has an annual forum spring and an annual conference in the fall. And then EAAA, East Asian Anthropological Association, there's an annual meeting on a rotating basis among the member countries, China, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. Okay, and then Korean Society for Physical Anthropology. like I said, I do not have much to say about this part of anthropology. There are a few biological anthropologists working, involved in this professional society from SNU. But I think more significantly, there are some emerging networks of scholars in related field in biological anthropology. Okay. All right. So generations of Korean anthropology. The first generation, when I divide generations, so first generation who had a PhD in anthropology. Okay. So they were from other disciplines like literature, sociology, or history, but they were trained in Japan, US, or Europe, and then they obtained the PhD in those higher institutions. In Kim Taek-gyu, he was trained in Japan, Han Sang-bok, US, Lee Moon-woong, US, yeah. Oh, Lee Kwang-gyu was trained in Austria. So then after they were trained and obtained, received their PhD, they founded anthropology department. So Kim Taek-gyu founded anthropology department at Yeongnam University, and Han Sang-bok founded SNU department. And Lee Kwang-gyu and then Lee Moon-woong worked together with Han Sang-bok. So they are the first generation of modern anthropology. And second generation, so after they founded departments, so there began to be undergraduate students. So undergraduate students of the first generation, they were US or Europe trained, and some trained in master's program at SNU. And third generation, so they began to come, master's students of the second generation, and they were predominantly US trained for their PhD, but more diverse folks were trained. This is my generation. Some went to Canada, France, Australia. Okay, so then there began to come doctoral students of the second generation at SNU. Okay, I'm sorry, the SNU. I talk a lot about SNU because SNU is really it has taken a big role in anthropology in Korea. But you will see later there are more other universities come into the picture. Okay, and then fourth generation, doctoral students of the third generation. So you see the progression here. The first generation, they didn't receive any undergraduate training in anthropology. And the second generation, they had an undergraduate training in anthropology. Third generation, they had master's training in anthropology. Fourth generation, they could have a doctoral training in anthropology in Korea. So some of them are now at university positions, and in fourth generation, there appeared more domestic doctors and more domestic doctoral programs in other universities, and there are more international doctoral students like Alyssa and Julia. You here too? So like my students. Okay, so we are having more international doctoral students too. Yes, I see Alicia. Alicia is a master's student from Malaysia. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, so that's fourth generation. All right. I just give you some population features of Korean anthropology just so that you can have some impression about how Korean anthropologists are composed of. Number of practicing anthropologists, I estimate as around 200, and 4 members of the Korean Society for Cultural Anthropology, 151 as of September this year. And anthropologists who are holding professional positions are around 150, okay, in South Korea. And I just had an opportunity to write about Korean anthropology for a Brazilian journal. So I had to do a very basic statistics. So I compiled some population, data statistics of 153 anthropologists. So this is meant to be approximate. Okay, so gender in my compilation, in my database, in terms of gender, there are 83 versus 70. So 54% versus 46%. So we are pretty close in gender. And when we combine age and gender, you can see the gender ratio is being reversed in the 40s. So through 60s from 60s and 80s, male 28, female 13. In 50s, male 30, female 24. 40s, male 24, female 30. Okay, the younger, the more female anthropologists. Okay, it's very encouraging, I think. Yeah. And then out of the 153, and then among Korean anthropologists, a very conspicuous social category has been whether you received your degree in domestic institutions or in foreign higher institutions. Okay, so it's it's a very conspicuous category, and then of course the prestige is on the foreign degree, Western trained PhDs. They have more prestige. They have a better opportunity for jobs, and so on. So that has been the reality. It's changing now. So US degree holders, out of 153, US degree holders, 44%, British 5, Australian 3, French 3. So altogether, Western degree holders are 55%, and South Korean degree holders, they are 35%. And Japanese 4%, and the rest, Canada, Germany, China, India, Indonesia, Singapore, the Philippines, Israel, Mexico. Okay, there are not many, one case each usually. So this is the configuration of the where you obtain your degrees. Okay, so degree granting institution is combined age. And then there's a very interesting recent trend. Okay, if we compare US degree holders to South Korean degree holders, in the 70s, in the age bracket, in the 70s, 8 of them have US degree holders. 8 of them are US degree holders. Only 1 is South Korean degree holder. In the 60s, 13 versus 8, 50s, 25 versus 16, and in 40s, 16 of them have US degrees and 26 of them have South Korean degrees. Okay, so the younger, the more people have South Korean degrees. Okay, so this reflects the increasing recruiting power of South Korean higher education institutions in general. And also, I think that, it is a sort of a fruit of conscious effort of the first and second generation anthropologists to train next generations in domestic programs. Okay. And then to continue on regional, to continue to speak population features of Korean anthropologists. Okay, and then another interesting feature of Korean anthropology is that we have a very diverse regional areas of specialty. Okay, just to count their regional areas of specialty in their PhD dissertation, out of 153. Korea counted 65. Okay, most of this is South Korea. Okay, 65. In the Northeast Asia, 41. China and Japan, China and Taiwan and Mongol. Okay, it's in the Southeast Asia 16, South Asia and Middle East 6, India was 3, Africa, Europe, North America, Latin America, South Pacific. Okay, so for the size we are very diverse in regional specialty. Oops, sorry. Okay, and then the employment situation. Okay, there are currently 46 positions in university anthropology departments, and then many anthropologists are hired in other departments like Korean studies, sociology, area studies, or general liberal arts education. Okay, and still others are employed in museums or research institutions, and in my counting, around 150 are in professional positions. Okay. And debates and issues in Korean anthropology. The kind of things that Korean anthropologists focus on or debate about are nature of traditional sociality and its transformation, characteristics of Korean kinship and social structure, confusion, family ideology, and its continuing or diminishing significance. All of these are about Korean social structure in general. Okay, and then we are also very interested in cultural similarities and differences among China, Korea, and Japan. Okay, you know, internationally, Korea is sort of always thought of as in between China and Japan. You know, we get questions like, okay, so which way is Korea? Is it China way or Japan way? So Korea is Korea. That's very much related to the cultural identity issue. So Korean anthropologists are interested in cultural differences and similarities among the neighboring countries. Okay. And historically, we have had these identity debates between cultural anthropology and folklore studies, like I showed you. Okay, and then the intellectual heritage from the colonial period is very much unresolved political issues too, but historical issues. It's not just in anthropology, but in the academia in general. We tend to not acknowledge the intellectual legacy of the colonial period. Okay, for Koreans, it seems to be really hard to recognize and accept and succeed and own the intellectual legacy of the colonial period, because there's a national and popular sentiment about the colonial period, which is like it was just so huge a humiliation, so that we can't really do something. We can't really. It's really hard to come to terms with the colonial legacy. But I really hope to see, we come to have a better terms with the intellectual heritage, at least from the colonial period. Okay, and then there's this recent drive for academic globalization, and this has certainly impacted anthropology in many ways. So there's a strong prioritization of citation index, English language journal articles publication. So I will talk a little about this later. Right. Themes and topics in Korean anthropology. Among those topics that are frequently studied by Korean anthropologists, regionally, Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia are most often very frequently studied. And kinship ideology and practice, colonialism, diaspora, migration, state violence, cultural heritage, community revitalization, tourism, ethno-ecological adaptation, indigenous knowledge, shamanism, folk rituals, all these have been very popular themes and topics. And new trends include queer, animal rights, healthcare, social disaster, digital finance, online sociality. Okay, and I would like to point out that there are some features, some very prominent features of South Korea, yet not frequently studied by Korean anthropologists. Okay, corporate culture and Korean Christianity. I mean, Korean Christianity has mega churches that has drawn international attention. But Korean anthropologists, they usually focus on shamanism, but they have not really seriously studied Christianity. And K-popular culture, it's huge. And North Korea, of course. So these are prominent, very prominent features of South Korea or South Korea related, but they are not frequently studied by Korean anthropologists. And last slide, okay. I'd like to conclude by thinking about Korean anthropology and Korean society and beyond, okay. So anthropology's place in Korea, we always have this issue of relevance. Anthropology have been struggling with this issue of relevance from the very beginning till now. And then much of the debate surrounding folklore studies and anthropology, it's also about the issue of relevance too, okay? So anthropology, you know, we want to be scientific, we want to be a modern discipline, we want to be, you know, properly anthropological, and yet we want to be relevant to Korea too. So one way was a huge contribution made by anthropologists was that we have produced regional area specialists, a very strong regional area specialist, okay? And that's part of, well, I remember that my teachers emphasized that, you know, you have to study other cultures, you have to go abroad, and you have to study you know, other than Korea. There was very strong emphasis on that. And I think that's partly because, you know, Korea has gone through modernization through export-driven economy. So nationally, we had this very strong need for area specialists. And I think anthropology was trying to meet that demand too, in a way. And so historically, Korea has been a very homogeneous national society, and a very historically it has been one nation state. And then Koreans, it's one ethno-linguistically one. There is not any historical minorities within, you know, the boundary, national boundary. And so this historical circumstance, and then the other historical factors that I mentioned, like, you know, division and then Korean War and so forth. And then so there has been, you know, the popular support for anthropology has been weak. Whereas there has been strong support for nationalist causes. So we have this tension, and then this contrast came down to the conflict between anthropology and folklore studies, like I said. But recently, there has been a global rise of K-culture industry, and I don't know what this would really mean to anthropology. I have to see. So we like to take this opportunity to make anthropology more relevant to Korea as Korea, you know, is more opening up more to the world. Okay, so recently, and then this is about anthropology's place in Korea, and then just several thoughts about international anthropological conversations. Recently, I think there are some changes in the global academic flow, and then there are some talks about decolonialization of academic knowledge production, particularly anthropological knowledge production. But I don't know if it will really be decolonialization. I mean, we all know that during the 1980s and 90s, there was lots of talk about post-colonialism, post-colonial studies and so forth. And then I sort of had some sort of bitter taste about post kind of things. You know, there were a lot of talk about post-colonial, but was it really about colonial, you know, post-colonial? I didn't really think so. And now there are talks about decolonialization of anthropology. And I really like to, I really think that, you know, we anthropologists based in Asia really need to do something about this new changes. Okay, so and I think there are possibilities and potentials of Asia-based anthropologists for global anthropological knowledge production, and elsewhere I have talked about, you know, if we want to do inter-Asia kind of intellectual conversations, we need to be more intra-Asia. We need to do more intra-Asia kind of conversations across the board, particularly in anthropology. Okay, that's why I was so honored to be part of this lecture series. Thank you. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Jung. And this is, I think, everyone agreed with me that this is an excellent lecture. No, and we enjoyed a lot. And the main important thing is that you have not only to show us what the historical trend, but also you have shown that you have done some of the analysis, no, some of the research you have done to understand what is going on. So before we proceed, it is our pleasure to tell you all of the participants that today we have in our participant list Professor Amitabh Pandey. He is one of the renowned environmental anthropologists in India. Welcome, sir, to our platform, and we are very happy to see you here.
Thank you. It was nice to listen to.
Yes. Anyway, Professor Jung, you know that at the initial part when you started your lecture, I have written a number of questions. No, so what the important things are, but wonderful. The thing is that throughout your discussion, throughout your lecture, you have given the most of the number of questions. No, you have delivered most of my queries regarding the status of the historical development of anthropology in Korea. So apart from that, I think at first I would ask the question from the participants. So after that, I will make some comment on that. Right. So now the forum is open to interact. So kindly put your question to Professor Jung. Professor Jung is very much enthusiastic, and she has done a lot of work in South Korea, and also he has very good grip of the historical development of the South Korean perspectives. So now the floor is open for the discussions. Please, is there any question? If you will have any question, kindly unmute and put your questions.
Thank you, Professor Jung. I am delighted to hear you, especially your statistics. You have given a wonderful statistics on the anthropologist of Korea. This is amazing. So thank you so much. I wanted to know, actually, when you were discussing the history of anthropology in Korea, at first it was archaeology and anthropology together, if I'm not wrong. Then the two departments divided, and archaeology merged with history, and anthropology became separated from archaeology. So what is the status now? Do anthropology department also teach archaeology, or since we have fourfold division, or it is only taught in the archaeology department, as you told? Is there any researches going on regarding archaeological anthropology in Korea? I wanted to know about archaeological anthropology. What is the fate of archaeological anthropology there?
Okay, thank you. So as Seoul National University, archaeology is joined with art history, and then the kind of, okay, so in archaeology department, some people there, I mean, it's not a huge department, it's small, but some of them, their degrees were in the US, the Department of Anthropology, and then they do archaeology. So when we say archaeology in Korea, it's more historical archaeology than anthropological archaeology. But some people do prehistorical archaeology. So in that area, there should be more connection with, anthropology. But presently, not much. In our department, our one biological and physical anthropologist, but we have several instructors in biological anthropology, and so we have courses in human osteology and other evolutionary sciences. Yeah, but it's hard. Archaeology is mostly they are mostly affiliated with history. So yeah, that's the situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? If you have in your mind, kindly, specifically the students, not only the India but also the abroad.
No, sir.
Okay. New Nabam.
Yes, sir.
New Nabam, are you from Arunachal?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir.
Okay. Welcome. Anyway, Ratna, do you have any question? Dr. Tharaka?
No, sir, it was a very great presentation.
Yeah. Do
Everything
you have
is
any
clear,
comment?
yes.
Please put the comment from.
Actually, when we are talking about during this lecture series, the thing that I learned was that the beginning of anthropology for all the South Asian countries are same.
Yes.
Same, and the thing that happened to us for all the countries are same. So I know now that all the Asian countries have same experiences as Sri Lanka, India, Korea, Japan, and all the things. Thank you very much for the nice presentation, ma'am.
Thank you.
Yes. Any other questions? So if not, then I would like to just ask few questions is actually roaming in my mind. So let's see come. So initially I thought that the ethnic diversity in South Korea, and he was told that there is one ethnic group that is Korean. So so far my knowledge goes, as Chinese, they are the minorities in Korea. No, who are the minorities?
We have a small group of Chinese descent people, and they're called Hwagyo, means Chinese.
Is there any indigenous populations living in Korea?
Korea's indigenous people on the Korean Peninsula, yes.
Yeah, in Japan, in Hokkaido, there is an indigenous population, So in Korea, it is not. So now, for my students, it is my question that what is the scope of international students in studying anthropology in SNU? So,
Oh, you mean where they are from?
they are from the Asian countries and also other parts. Yes. What is the scope of international students in studying anthropology in your university?
You mean their research interest or their
Yes.
original country?
Research, only research interest.
Oh, research interest. Okay. So, okay, speaking of my own students, Elisa, her dissertation project is Korean adoption. Oh, Elisa, yeah, okay. You may speak yourself.
Yes, she can speak. Kindly unmute, Elisa.
Okay, now that I'm here, yeah, well, as Professor was saying, my interest is in domestic adoption, well, adoption in general in Korea, but broadly kinship. As she mentioned before, the broad interest that is in kinship structures and the change in the ways that families perceived and the social functions. And also in my case, I'm interested in anthropology of public policy and practical anthropology, kind of, which to my knowledge is not very broad in South Korea right now, but I have heard from some students who are also beginning to become interested. So yeah, on my and of course Korean studies and Korean history and everything Korean.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. All the best, Elisa, for you.
Thank you.
And my other student, Julia, she's not here now, but Julia, she studies emotional socialization in Kazakhstan high school. It's a national identity and selfhood and emotional education. So that's her project. And then Alicia was here. Alicia, she's a master's student. She studies the online gaming. Alicia, you are here? Okay, yeah. So she studies online gaming. And yeah, that's international students. And then we have quite a few Chinese students, and they tend to study either China or Korea. Yeah, yeah. And then we used to have quite a few Japanese students who were interested in studying Korea. But recently we are not having Japanese students. Yeah, so yeah.
For research degree, it is required to understand Korea if any students will be willing to join your department.
Sure, because most lectures are in Korean. Elisa, she speaks Korean, but she is writing her dissertation in English.
Okay. Yeah. Very good. So this is a big things, no? So I just remember my memory that before 5 to 6 years, I put one interest to join one conference in Thailand. So the organizer said to me that, sir, it is quite impossible to invite you because this is for the native language. No, that is a bit problematic. Anyway, thank you. All the best to you students. Now, the thing is that just I compare the Korea and Vietnam and China because we already have these lectures, no? So in China, what I saw that there is a contradictions between the ethnology and anthropology, no? Social culture anthropology. So in Vietnam, where the governments are giving priority to the ethnology in compared to the anthropology. So just reverse in Vietnam. So there is a government priorities goes towards the anthropology instead of ethnology. Now for your country, you told that there is a competition between anthropology and folklore studies. What about the opinion of the policymakers and government for the future of these two subjects in comparing to?
Well, okay. So for one thing, if you so anthropology students, they often some of Korean students are here. So they often complain that if I say I study anthropology, people always ask what anthropology is. What is it? So people do not really have an understanding about what anthropology is. And I had difficulty in having my parents understand anthropology, what I study. Okay, so they do have some understanding now, but it took many decades. So just a joke. But anyway, so there's very you know, a low recognition about anthropology. But if you say folklore or folk, if you study Korean folk, if you say, if you know, I study Korean folklore, they might, you know, they might say, oh, that's what you study. They might think they do have some understanding, although they may not know what folklore study is. So, and policymakers, they have some, you know, policies that aim to promote Korean culture, and so then historians and then literate or archaeology or some other disciplines like who have, you know, who can have focus on material culture, like costumes or ethnomusicology, these kind of things, they will appear that they study folklore or folk customs, and then so that they can be part of government projects. Yeah, so anthropology sounds like just too foreign to policymakers, to, you know, but if you say folklore or folk culture, then, oh yeah, so then we have some project that you can do. So that's a kind of situation. But anthropology did succeed to establish itself in, you know, universities. So yeah.
Hopefully in the near future, it will base in more solid way, no? So that is our hope for Asian countries itself also. So that is why this international lecture series is very important, for to unite all these anthropologists to know that whatever you have delivered today regarding the South Korean anthropological perspectives, it may not be understandable to the actually they are not new to the Vietnamese anthropologist or the Indonesian anthropologist or the Thailand anthropology from Thailand. And your student from Malaysia, no, professor, one of the professor who delivered the lecture from Malaysia, he told that anthropologists need the revolution to unite the anthropologists within Malaysia. No, so that is very important, and try to link all these disciplines. Now, the last question is, now Chinese anthropologists, now they are trying to understand the culture of China who are living outside the China. Whether the Korean anthropologists have there in their mind to study the Korean who are living outside the Korea.
Yeah. So you know, I don't resent folklore studies in itself. What I resent is that, you know, if you just focus on folk and Korean folk, okay, you lose the you know, the perspective, you know, to go beyond Korea, okay, to see beyond Korea, to see that Korea is part of the bigger picture, you know, and then you lose this conversation, opportunities for conversation to connect Korea to, you know, other societies, other cultures. You know, Korea is not, well, Korea may be center of the world to many of us in some ways, but Korea is part of the world. I mean, just like any other world is part of the bigger world. Okay, so but folklore studies tends to have a very, in my perspective, they tend to have a very inward-looking kind of orientation. So that's why I like to you know, if I like to incorporate folklore studies tradition into anthropology. Maybe I'm an anthropological imperialist in this regard. But I'd like to have a broader, you know, perspective, including folklore studies, Korean culture, whatever that is, you know, so that we can have a broader horizon, you know, in which Korea is part of it.
Okay, thank you. So the last just comment, you know that in Indonesia, whatever the Professor Yunita said, that we can recognize the father of Indonesian anthropology as Kunjaraningrat. So do you put any name as a father of Korean anthropology?
Oh, the father, well, like I said, the first generation, they are all the founders of anthropology department. Yeah, so.
There's, okay, fine. They are the founders of the first generations of the anthropology. Anyway, so hopefully the participants, we are just running short of time because we have passed 1
There's
hour
one
and 20 minutes.
person who raised her hand.
Yes, Abigail.
Yeah.
Abigail Lanunan, do you have any questions?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Questions. I was very interested with the presentation, yes, today, and physical anthropologist, that's my specialization. And in one of the slides, it was mentioned about the, you know, like the colonial, early interest in colonial anthropology, where I'm under the impression that physical anthropology research in Korea, this was actively conducted, maybe hand in hand with imperial expansion, and largely driven by an interest for measuring body, and which we still do in our research, even here in India. So my question to the professor is, like, what are the roles of this colonial physical anthropologies at present? Is there a continuity of this physical anthropology studies, which is similar to this, say, colonial settings? And what's the continuity, like, of physical anthropology through colonial or post-colonial periods? And how do they justify this, say, this kind of work at present?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think, okay, so Korea is it is a very difficult case for physical anthropology to really establish itself, because we don't have any primates in the national society. I mean, in Korea, we don't have any primates, okay? And then so physical anthropology, our physical anthropologist in our department, she did biometrics, is that what you call it? Anthropometrics.
Right.
Yeah, okay, so I'm sorry. Okay, so
anthropometric measurements, you know.
Yeah, so that was her PhD dissertation project. She measured Korean adolescent bodies for dissertation project. And then afterwards, she also did her project about North Korean refugees. And then so that's her area of specialty, but she tried very hard to train next generation of physical anthropologists in various subfields of biological anthropology. And she thinks, she wrote about this colonial legacy of physical anthropology in journal articles, and in those pieces, she claimed that colonial physical anthropology was very much focused on anatomical descriptions, and without any theoretical articulations, without any evolutionary framework, evolutionary theoretical framework to argue with. So there wasn't really any theoretical development to come out of those research projects. And so but she did acknowledge that the colonial anthropological works had produced valuable data about Korean physical features, as well as some people in Manchuria and Taiwan. But there needs, but to in order to use those data, those products of the colonial physical anthropology, there has to be professional assessment of those works. So that has to be done, and it has not done yet. So that's it's also very much unresolved. Yeah.
Yes, that is very, very important data. I think Dr. Obigil,
Abigail, sir.
Obigil, right.
Yes, sir.
So, Dr. Obigil, I think you satisfied your answer.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes,
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor.
Yes, Professor Jung, it is very, very good opportunity for the physical anthropologists too, to understand the longitudinal changes, no? So if you have this data in the future time, hopefully due to the skills of the enhancement of the skills of the anthropologists who are studying the physical anthropology or biological anthropology, so they can use this data for understanding the changes of the longitudinal changes of the populations. Yes, thank you, Abhijal, Dr. Abhijal, and give my regards to Professor Nitish Mondal also.
Sure, sir. We'll do that.
Anyway, thank you. And now we are at the end of this today's lecture. And may I ask now Dr. Ratnatayan to give the vote of thanks.
Thanks, Suman sir. Indeed, a great honor for me to propose the vote of thanks. On behalf of the Department of Anthropology, University of Sri Jayawardhanepura, Mrinalini, Datta, Mahavidyapith, and my Dera Natung Government College, convey our gratefulness to Professor Jung, Department of Anthropology, Seoul National University, Republic of Korea, for accepting our request to deliver today's lecture of our international lecture series, jointly organized by the three departments. And ma'am, your expertise and subsequent deliberation on the various historical aspects of Korean anthropology have given us so much food for thoughts. Thank you very much. I also convey our gratitude to Professor Amitabh Pandey for being part of this today's lecture. I would also like to acknowledge our gratefulness to all the participants for your gracious presence and being part of today's lecture. We sincerely hope you all will continue to encourage and support us in all the upcoming lecture. Thank you all once again. Over to you, sir.
Yes, yes. Now we are just end. Let me stop the recording and